Well, one of the things I've learned from reading your work and other folks who've reported on this movement is that it's been going on for a while. A lot of these organizations and the networks that you just described, they go back to the late 70s, early 80s. But it seems like something's changed recently. So as someone who's followed this for a while, why would you say people are talking a lot more about Christian nationalism right now?
I think with January 6th, well, there are a couple things. With January 6th, we've really crossed a Rubicon between that and Trump, a former president promoting the lie of the stolen election. I think that really has changed things an awful lot. And then all the stuff that's happened recently, of course, with the sort of taking home, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of documents pertaining to our national security. I would not have predicted that the movement would actually stand behind something so egregious and shocking, and yet a memo that was produced by the Conservative Action Project, which is affiliated with the Council for National Policy, basically said, we need to investigate the FBI over this, and defended the actions of our former president. And it was signed by an extraordinary number of leaders of different different organizations. Yeah. But it was also signed by, folks from there was somebody from FreedomWorks and somebody from ALEC signing this. I just found that really shocking. It's like, if any, a Navy admiral, a Navy admiral or any other sort of public official,
or say a Secretary of State,
anybody else had done this, would they be walking around on the street right now? I mean, it's really astonishing. But I think January 6th was a big one for a lot of people. We can't understand what happened that day without understanding the role of Christian nationalism. First of all, the ideology of Christian nationalism persuaded a lot of the people who were storming the Capitol that the election was stolen. That Trump was God's choice. He was God's guy. That's what they'd been told. And so if he lost the election, it must be against God's will. And so they believed that the election was stolen. And they had been also persuaded that they're in an apocalyptic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. So they're willing to do any action, no matter how radical, in order to stop it. But I think more than that, the networks of the movement, and I think to a very underappreciated degree, they spread the lies of the stolen election long before January 6th. I was at a gathering, go to these, past dozen plus years I've been doing this research. I go to strategy gatherings and pastoral gatherings and meetings and conferences. So I went to an event in Chantilly, Virginia, that's put on by an organization called Faith Wins. They've done hundreds of events for thousands of pastors all across the country. In churches, they get pastors together and they have presentations and give them materials. So if any of you know who David Barton is, he's a kind of very popular myth maker of the Christian nationalist movement, and he's also he's very politically connected. He sits on the boards of a lot of initiatives.
So he would be happy to give you a tour of the U.S. Capitol.
Exactly.
Gives you all of the story he tells about the Christianity of the founders, yes.
So he and his son were there to deliver talks about how, America is a Christian nation, according to a very deeply reactionary understanding of the Christian faith, etc. And there were other speakers. But with them was a guy named Hogan Gidley, who is a former member of the Trump administration, who was presented as an elections integrity specialist. And he was there to spread misinformation about elections. He said, did you guys see all the terrible things that happened? Paraphrasing here, but he said, did you see all the terrible things that happened in Arizona? This was several weeks after a Republican-led investigation of potential irregularities, voting irregularities in Arizona, yielded nothing. Nothing came up, and yet he was there sort of still profiting from this story because it was too useful to discard just because it wasn't true. And another speaker stood up and said, the church is not a cruise ship, the church is a battleship. So one of the things that the movement does is they draw conservative-leaning pastors into these networks, such as Faith Wins, such as Watchmen on the Wall, such as Church Unite, or Ministros Hispanos, which is a network that targets Latino and Hispanic clergy, and give them messaging materials, sometimes data tools, very sophisticated data tools, instructions for how to get their congregations to turn out to vote their biblical values, and those supposed biblical values inevitably boil down to just a few or three, two or three of these key culture war issues.
You would think, I mean, if you've ever picked up a Bible that's pretty big, you would think there would be more issues than those, especially since they're not mentioned very much within the book. Yeah.
But this is very challenging, I think, for pastors who don't sort of buy into this, who are sort of standing on the outside and saying, this doesn't represent my faith at all.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what have you seen has been the sort of reaction to this, and how do people deal with it?
Well, part of the reason, I've been having conversations like this one is there is a lot of confusion in churches. Churches where people are sort of genuinely wondering, how are our people so taken by the, it's not everybody, people know that within church communities, but it sure seems like more and more people get caught up in things that sound absolutely crazy. Like things that are verifiably not true, but like you were saying, there's some value to this story, and so it keeps getting told and retold. As I've tried to make sense of it, the best explanation I can come up with, actually our sociologist friends have helped me to see, that sometime during the second term of the Obama presidency, there was an important shift in religious demographics in this country. That is, white Christians became a minority for the first time in American history. That happened somewhere around 2014, 2015. That had never happened before. And I think what it created was this identity crisis where people who are the inheritors of a Christian tradition that has fit pretty comfortably with white supremacy in this country. And I don't mean white supremacy like that wears a hood and rides around with a burning cross. I mean just the presumption that white people are in charge, which is what most people have believed for most of the history of this country. And most Christians have believed that too. And I think there was a long, struggle with the basic morality of that developed within churches, really, a text that can lead you to follow the teachings of Jesus and, the way of God's people through history, and that has existed alongside what was really a slaveholder religion, right? That developed a theology that explained why the white people were in charge, why it was good for the white people that they were in charge, why it was good for the black people that the white people were in charge, right? This was all sort of worked out in a reasonable way, and that too has been passed down. So these traditions coexist within churches, and now all of a sudden, for the first time, white Christians are a minority. And I think that's creating an identity crisis. And I don't think most of our churches were very well prepared to deal with that. That's my read on where we are. Does it strike you that the people who are being drawn into this are having some kind of, there's a lot of identity at the source of this, right? There's a lot of, it's offering a story.
And that's right. I mean, religious nationalism, wherever it shows up, says that certain people will truly belong in our country and others don't. It's kind of an exclusionary nationalism, and it identifies people who do not belong as targets for contempt and targets for scapegoating. But I do think that a lot of this is driven to some degree by status loss. I think that, listen, we're living in an era of rising economic inequality. That's not an opinion, that's something you can look to the economists and others to sort of, they document that very carefully. And I think that a lot of people feel like things are a little bit out of control. You've got climate instability, the very rapid pace of technological change. I think it creates a kind of insecurity among a lot of people, and that makes people, I think, vulnerable to messaging that affirms them as being sort of, well, you're righteous and you can truly belong in the club as long as you sort of affirm this certain very, it's not even religious beliefs, really, it's more like politicized, like a sort of, or like a sort of political views with religious overtones, I should say.
Believing your politics religiously.
Yeah, it's really fun. Bradley Onishi, who's got a terrific book coming out soon. He said to me, he said to me, your politics, your belonging doesn't even is not really based in religion anymore. It's not even, it's complicated. He said it's not entirely based on race even. It's really on your politics. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but that sort of sense of identity. You're inside or you're outside. You're pure or you're impure. A thing that's changed, I think, in recent years that I've observed is that the movement is increasingly engaging in this demonization of the political other. I've gone to these Road to Majority conferences. There are annual gatherings that Ralph Reed, who's one of the movement's very seasoned strategist, puts together. And speaker after speaker will call Democrats satanic, demonic, say, if we don't win these elections, we're going under the control of Satan, the Illuminati for hundreds of years. I mean, I've heard that. I've heard a lot of metaphors of war and battle, and metaphors of battle are very common in among political gatherings of all sorts. But the language is getting sort of more specific, less metaphorical, more concrete, and actually more angry than I've ever heard it. And this demonization is incredibly dangerous. I think about somebody like Vladimir Putin, and this war in Ukraine, and how he's calling his opponents, demonic. And I was watching Russian state TV through a translator, and I saw this one speaker say, these Ukrainians are little devils, they're godless, they're satanic. And you good Orthodox soldiers, you need to finish them off. Mm-hmm. This is really dangerous, this kind of demonization of one's political other. Yeah. And that's part of what's driving the polarization that we're seeing. Yeah. But there's one other thing I just want to say about that. I think that the polarization makes our country less governable, more chaotic, less able to sort of come together and solve our problems. And it makes the country more ripe for an authoritarian reaction. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's by design. It's one of the reasons why foreign actors that do not have America's interests at heart have also tried to play into that polarization and amplify these sort of demonize others, amplify these angry voices. So I think that's very concerning.
Yeah, it is. And well, this was part of what we wanted to talk about in terms of the danger that this movement presents to all of us.